Today's subject matter is China's syndrome for the Atari 2600 video computer system, and though it is a common misconception, this game has nothing to do with the 1979 motion picture of the same name. Rather, the term China syndrome is a fancy way of describing a fictitious worst-case scenario regarding a nuclear meltdown, where reactor components would melt through their containment structures and into the underlying Earth, supposedly all the way to China. Which is quite impossible. But you remember some of those old cartoons where characters would dig through the earth and then end up in China for some reason? Actually, you know what? Forget it. That's a stupid reference. So here's the deal with China's syndrome. You have a screen split into 3 zones of red, blue, and yellow. The crosshair you move around represents your robotic arm, and what you're doing here is you're guiding your robotic arm around to collect all the radiation particles within the 3 zones before they cause a nuclear meltdown of catastrophic proportions. The titular China syndrome, if you will. Collecting the particles is done by guiding your arm over the particle and pressing the button to grab them. As time progresses, however, the remaining particles will split into 2, and if they begin to overwhelm the zones and reach critical mass, you lose a life. Subsequently, if your robotic arm touches one of these cooling vents of varying sizes, you also lose a life. Lose all your lives and you get one of the most painful game over screens ever conceived. But if you clear all the particles from all 3 zones, you earn an extra life and move on to the next level, of which there are 10. Once you clear the final level, the game simply ends. There's a fair bit of challenge to the game, especially later on when zones will be filled with giant cooling vents and fast-moving particles. But challenge can also come from your own negligence. If you don't clear the particles in time, they start to split, and it isn't long before there is a plethora of them bouncing about at such a high speed that the possibility of recovering from such a mess can seem almost near impossible because your little robotic arm cannot keep up with the speed of these things. Control is simple and somewhat responsive. Your robotic arm moves about a bit sluggishly, but this can be somewhat fixed by toggling the difficulty switch to make it move faster, albeit harder to control. You cannot grab onto a particle while moving, so you sort of have to anticipate the particle's path and grab it once it's in reach. While the general idea of the game is somewhat interesting, gameplay in general felt a bit monotonous and dull when it really shouldn't. The concept is interesting, the idea is actually quite sound, and there's actually some semblance of depth as far as anticipating the path of the particles go. But in terms of the actual execution, China Syndrome feels less like a game of skill with something of an addicting quality, and more like a chore of tedium with a tendency to cure insomnia. It just doesn't hold your interest for too long and ends up being a bore all around. You could argue that you could play to see the game's ending, but 10 levels of play for a simple all-clear message is hardly worth the effort, especially when the game over sequence is much more elaborate, albeit dull and painful. You could argue that you could play for a high score, but playing China Syndrome effectively means you'll be getting a low score because it's 1 point per particle, and that's it. There's no bonus points for a speedy recovery or anything of the sort. In order to get a high score, you have to let the particles split, and, well, there's not much to China Syndrome visually. It's just a bunch of dots bouncing about 3 sections of the screen, along with a crosshair to move around and cooling vents. It's not the most visually sophisticated game on the 2600, but it's good for what it is, even if it isn't much. Not much to say in regards to sound. Sound effects are your typical Atari sound effects, beeps, bleeps, and a massive explosion of static noise for the meltdown. Not much else to say in that regard. China Syndrome is not exactly a hidden gem of sorts. I can admit that the concept of averting a nuclear catastrophe would make for an interesting video game, but that's not what we're getting with China Syndrome. Instead, it's a rather dull and cumbersome puzzle game that doesn't do much to keep you interested. Overall, I wasn't impressed with China Syndrome and can recall more often than not how often I fell asleep playing this game. As a matter of fact, as I'm recording, I'm starting to feel a bit tired just talking about it. Unless you're looking to fill the Atari collection for another SpectraVision video game, I wouldn't bother with this one. I'm going to bed. Fuck me, I'm tired. Oh boy. Good night.